Okay, so it's interesting when I sent the email, I kind of mainly was focusing on chapter 5, but then I looked back and I realized that there were like some key elements of chapter 4 that we didn't really get a chance to get into. So I want to start by reviewing what we did do in chapter 4, and then leading into chapter 5. So I think we'll probably only touch the beginning of chapter 5 today. One of the things we discussed last time is that struggle of the inside me versus the outside me. A lot of people feel that it feels like a struggle when my inside and my outside don't match. When it comes to Judaism specifically, you have people who say, I'm not really worthy of doing all this religious stuff, because I'm not really so religious inside, like I don't want to pretend and be a faker or a hypocrite, go to synagogue, do all these things when really so much of my life, I'm not doing that stuff. So it just feels wrong to be doing something so Jewish on the outside when on the inside, maybe I don't feel so strongly Jewish. Then you have people who have the opposite approach. They say, I feel so Jewish on the inside. I have a really strong, really good relationship with God. I don't need all of these, petty actions and rituals. I don't do organized religion. I can have a fantastic relationship with God in my heart. I don't need to go to synagogue, hear the shofar, light the candles. I can do Jewish my own way. I can have a spiritual connection my own way. What chapter 4, one of the biggest messages of chapter 4 is that there really is a very big gift and opportunity in doing something externally, even if it doesn't fully line up with who I think I am internally. We spoke about the inside, the personality of the soul versus the garments of the soul. If we think about a person, right? Think about a person's personality. We could change, obviously we change as people over time, but changing who you really are at the core is a very slow and gradual change. I mean, my personality, my capabilities, my talents, there's a lot of it that will stay the same over time. If you look at me now and you look at me, 20, 30 years ago, I hope that I changed and I grew and I developed as a person, but a lot of core parts of me are still the same. I'm not going to change my personality or my capabilities. If I'm an intellectual type of person or I'm an emotional type of person, I'm a creative person, I'm an organized person, a lot of those basic traits will stay the same or maybe just change slightly. At the same time, when it comes to clothes, at any given time, I could put on an outfit and dress as whatever I want. I could wear 100 different outfits in a day, right? Whether they do or don't match my personality, it doesn't matter. In the moment, I can wear that garment. So an example of that would be, let's say you have someone they're not really a philosophical person. They're a practical person. They don't like to think too deeply. It's just not in their personality. But I sit down with them and I say, look, I just need you to give me an hour of your time. I really want you to listen to this intellectual, philosophical thought I'm going to share with you. They can choose to say yes. It's not their type. They would never do it on their own. They would never sit in a philosophy class. But as a favor to me, they will sit for an hour and listen to my ramble and play the part. It's not who they are. It's what they're doing. It's what they're engaging in. I mean, they could even go further. They could go and memorize a few lines that make them sound really smart and philosophical. And they can throw those lines about in a new crowd and people will be like, wow, that person's a real philosopher, without it actually being who they are. Sometimes we see that as a negative thing, like, oh, that's so fake. There's who you are and here you're pretending to be something else. Chapter 4 brings a different approach. Chapter 4 says there actually is a benefit to being able to act in a way that's different or better or higher than who you really are inside. Why is it a gift? Because when the soul puts on garments, we said the garments of the soul are the expression of the soul, the thought, the speech, and the action. When I engage in conscious thought, speech, and action that are godly, I'm doing godly actions. I'm doing a mitzvah. Forget for a moment whether I believe it or not, whether I care for it or not. In this moment, I am wearing this garment. You know what I just did? I just put on godly clothes. It doesn't even matter where I am on the inside. Instead of the clothing being secondary to who I am, the clothes are able to allow me to transcend who I am. I can put on, it's like saying I can put on presidential clothes and be the president at this moment, even though I'm not really the president. But at that moment, I can be president. If you think for a second about someone who works in the clown business, I don't know what the proper term for that is, right? But you meet them in day-to-day life, you go out for dinner with them, they're just a nice person, maybe they're funny, maybe they're not so funny. As soon as they put on their clown costume, it's almost like they have permission to just be this character. They grow into the character. They act that character. Instead of saying is like, oh, that's so fake, that's not the real you, you're just acting a character, you could say, wow, you're like expressing a part of you that you don't get to express in everyday life. And what chapter 4 is telling us is stop worrying about what's going on the inside of you, how perfectly you feel, how convinced you are, how much you believe or don't believe. You have an opportunity at any given time to put on godly garments by engaging in godly actions. Thought, speech, and action that are godly can allow you to be that. You can express that part of you even if you don't fully feel it on the inside. And this is why, I don't know if we read this inside last time or not, but we spoke about the word mitzvah. The word mitzvah, we tend to translate as a commandment. The Aramaic translation of the word mitzvah comes from the word tzavta, which means connection. So what the Tanya here is saying is that doing a mitzvah is an opportunity to connect. So I know we've mentioned this before, but instead of saying, I need to do 613 commandments, I get to connect to God in 613 different ways. How many of those am I going to grasp today? And it's a very different approach to looking at a mitzvah. I know last time we brought down the story of the pro golfer who was trying to create an opportunity for the child to connect with them and gave the child, a job to do. You can look at it and say, oh my, the child has to carry the golf clubs for this golfer. You could say, wow, this kid gets an opportunity to connect to a hero. That's incredible. And that's really what chapter 4 was trying to tell us. It's trying to tell us that doing a mitzvah, you have to look at it as an opportunity to connect, to transcend myself. So sure, I could be very spiritual in my heart and I could say, I don't need all these rituals. I could just connect to God on my own terms. But you know what? When I do these rituals that God asks me to do, I can connect to God beyond my own terms. I can connect to God on his terms. If my connection to God is only limited to how I feel like expressing my connection to him, that's a limited connection. I heard such a good example of this. I thought it was a great example. It's like, think of a guy who tells his wife, honey, I love you so much. I don't need to do anything to show you that I love you. I just love you. Like, I'm not going to clean up. I won't take out the garbage. I'm not going to do the dishes. I honestly think that's embarrassing. I love you. My love for you is so deep and sophisticated that, like, taking out the trash, I'd rather write you poetry. Like, I wouldn't take out the trash to show you how much I love you. And I wouldn't do any of those other things you want me to do for you because my love for you is, beautiful. And I don't want to taint it with any of these silly little things you want me to do. What would you tell him? Seriously, love is in the action, right? You really love her, then start doing what she wants you to do. And if he says, okay, fine, I'll do things for you, but not those things. I'll write poetry for you. I'll sing a song for you. And meanwhile, she's sitting there saying, like, please, I need the dishes done. I need this errand taken care of. I need you to show up on time. I need you to, come with me to, this, that, the other. You can compare that to the person who says, I love God. I'm so deeply connected to God. But this organized religion thing, I mean, that's so silly. I don't need to hear the shofar to show God that I love him. I'm going to show God that I love him my own ways. I have my own ways of, I like to meditate. Maybe I write poetry for God. Maybe I write my own prayers, whatever it is that I do to show my love for God. If we see it as a relationship and a connection to another, then relationship is in the actions, and not just in the actions that I care for, and the actions that the other person cares for, the other party cares for. If it's true in a human relationship, how much more so in a godly relationship where we're trying to connect with something infinite, like we mentioned last time, like, say a mosquito is trying to have a relationship with me, and the mosquito says, like, oh yeah, I'll have a relationship with you. I'll just bite you. That's how I connect to you. And I say, well, you want to have a relationship with me? Then I'm going to tell you how this relationship works. This is what I need you to do for me. We understand in every relationship that, there needs to be action, and there needs to be action that's desirable and desired by the other party for a real relationship. And that was really, I would say, like the summary of what we covered last time in chapter 4 about actions being, yes, we could have a whole nother discussion about developing ourselves and developing our emotions. And chapter 5 is actually, definitely going to touch on that. But the part of action of doing the mitzvahs, whether I understand them or not, whether they make sense or not, every time I do them, I'm wearing godly garments and I'm connecting to God on his terms. It's like, let's say in that same story of the husband who loves his wife so much, but, doesn't want to do the dishes. And he says, you know what? I'm going to think about it. When I really feel that strong desire to do the dishes, when I fully understand why dishes will express my love for you, then I'm going to do the dishes. It's like, please do the dishes, and then you could do your thinking later, right? That's similar to someone who says, there's all these mitzvahs. I don't understand some of them. Maybe when I understand them, then I can do them. I'm not going to sit and do things that make no sense to me. Thoughts, questions, comments?
Jeannie, I was gonna say, this is Trisha. I'm here. I'm walking.
Hi, Trisha.
My camera on, but Charlie Harari. I don't know if you guys have ever listened to him, but he has one of his talks that he was talking about was acting as if, like any change that somebody makes, there has to be, the first step has to be acting as if, which kind of is what you were saying in the beginning, the authentic versus unauthentic, right? So any change that someone makes, the first step, you have to act as if that other person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I definitely hear that. I'm thinking, someone's making a New Year's resolution, like, I'm going to start going to the gym. And then they say, well, I'm not really the gym type of person. I've never gone to the gym before.
Right.
So
Right.
there's a part of it that I'm going to have to kind of force myself to do at first.
Right.
At the same time, we'll all agree that if I don't work on inspiring myself to keep going to the gym, then it's not going to last for too long. It's going to be hard to keep it up if I can't keep myself inspired about it. So 100%, we're talking about the one part of why action is so important.
Mhm.
And there's the other part of, why inspiration is equally important, but we don't wait for the inspiration before the action. But thanks for adding that.
Mhm.
We actually had a long discussion in my house with some college students about this whole concept about, is it hypocritical to do Jewish some of the time if I don't do it all the time? There's actually a letter that somebody wrote to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. This was published later. And he said, Rabbi, I'm going to be totally honest. I'm not religious, and I don't plan to ever be religious. It's just not going to happen. But I engage in Jewish things, you know? I do maybe high holidays. There are some mitzvahs that I do. There are some other things that I do. Some things I do sometimes, not other times. But recently I've been thinking about it and I realized that it's just totally hypocritical because either I do it all the time or I do it none of the time. Like doing this on and off Judaism just doesn't make sense. So I'm basically ready to drop it, just drop the whole thing. So at least I can be an honest person who's not a walking hypocrite, unless you can convince me that there is some value in sometimes doing it, even though other times I'm not doing it. And we asked the students to share, you know, what their response to this question would be. Yes, Arlene.
What we're talking about makes me wonder, how would you differentiate between the term religious and observant?
I hate the term religious.
Do you think, no, but do you consider them to be one and the same? Could you feel religious in that you feel your Jewishness, you feel your connection to God, you feel your love of tradition, you feel moved by that which is Jewish, but as opposed to being observant of the mitzvot?
So, I mean, I think that different people will interpret them differently. I personally like the term observant better because I feel that observant unites us. We all observe some level of Judaism. Something, right? Whether it is that we go to synagogue on Yom Kippur or that some of the food that we eat is kosher, willingly or not willingly. You know, there's no Jew in the world that doesn't observe any mitzvahs. Some observe more, some observe less, some are constantly trying to observe more, and some maybe started off observing more and today are observing less. But observant is just a unifying term. We are Jews who try to observe Jewishly to the best of our ability. I think that the term religious, at least the way I've been exposed to it, is more like stereotypical. It's more like trying to give someone a label. They're religious, they're not religious. They're Reformed, they're Orthodox, they're, you know, whatever it is. So I personally, you know, stay away from the term religious, but I think that you'll meet different people who will interpret each of those terms differently. Like they're not godly terms, you know, everyone can attach their own meaning to them based on their own experiences. So it's interesting because in having this discussion about, is it hypocritical? So we spoke about what's the purpose of doing a mitzvah altogether. Maybe if you understand the function of doing a mitzvah, then you can understand if it's hypocritical to do it some of the time and not all the time. And even from the angle that we just discussed now, the angle of mitzvah being a connection, if I am saying goodbye to my mom, because I'm going to college, and I'm not going to see her for 4 months, and I'm not going to get to hug her for the next 4 months, is it hypocritical of me to give my mom a really big hug now, even though I'm not going to hug her for the next 4 months? I mean, we'd laugh like that's silly. Of course it's not hypocritical. If I could only afford one diamond ring in my lifetime, is it hypocritical of me to give my spouse a diamond ring once, even though I won't give them another diamond ring next month? We don't see it that way. Is it hypocritical if I can do something for my best friend today, even though I won't be available to do it for them tomorrow? Or I throw someone a big party for their birthday this year, even though I know that last year I didn't get to throw them a party. I was going through too many things. And next year I might not either get to throw them a party because they're moving. Is it hypocritical to do it now? We don't look at it that way because in a connection, in a relationship, the more I do, the more I connect. The less I do, the less I connect. Every time I have an opportunity to do something and connect is better for the relationship. So in most areas of life, we don't think of life as all or nothing. But somehow when it comes to Judaism, it's something that a lot of people think about. Like, hey, you know, it's hypocritical of me. I never went to synagogue before Rosh Hashanah, so why should I go this year? That's like hypocritical. You know, I never keep kosher, and now I have an opportunity to choose between a kosher meal and a non-kosher meal. Why would I choose the kosher meal if I didn't eat kosher yesterday and I probably won't eat kosher tomorrow? But we'd never say that in any other relationship. So if I redefine mitzvahs and I realize that a mitzvah is an opportunity for connection, every time I have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, it's great. And if I have an opportunity to do 10 mitzvahs, fantastic. I don't have to make this calculation of what I did yesterday, what I'm going to do tomorrow. Of course, we're always trying to grow and get better, but it's not all or nothing in any way. And I think chapter 4 really highlights that. Actually, at the very end of chapter 4, there's a beautiful allegory that says, someone might say, well, you're saying that I'm grasping God through a mitzvah, but a mitzvah is a very physical act. So clearly, this God, who is transcendent, lowered himself into this physical mitzvah to make it accessible to me. So you might say, I'm not really grasping God. I'm grasping like the physical manifestation of God. And the very end of the chapter says, it's like giving a king a hug. Imagine you're coming to give a king a hug, and the king is wearing a double layer robe. Imagine you're coming to give the king a hug, and the king is wearing 20 layers of clothing. You still gave him a hug. Still the same king under all those clothes. So when I'm connecting to God through a physical mitzvah, through giving charity, through, you name the mitzvah, whichever it is that's coming up, through celebrating this particular holiday, through doing this act of kindness, I'm giving God a hug. Who cares how many layers of clothes he's wearing? I am actively connecting in this relationship. And there's one more piece that I wanted to mention before we end the chapter, is the chapter says, and this is why it's known, some people think of spiritual connection, they think of the afterlife, and when souls are beyond bodies, that's like the real spiritual connection. And there are many quotes in Judaism that say that the one mitzvah done in this world is so much more valuable than all the godly light that a soul can experience up there in heaven. And here's where you can understand it, because when a soul is disembodied, when a soul is up there, it can't grow the relationship. It could bask in a godly light, but it can't actually do anything because it doesn't have the garments, the thought, speech, and action ability to do things for the relationship. So it can sit there and enjoy the fruits of anything it's done before. That's why there's a concept in Judaism that we do mitzvahs in memory of loved ones who have passed. Why do a mitzvah for them? Because they can't do mitzvahs for themselves anymore. So when I do a mitzvah in memory of a loved one, I am being their hands and feet. I am wearing the garments for them because they can't wear the garments anymore. So it's a misconception to think that the greatest spirituality is in the lofty worlds on a soul level. The greatest spirituality that we can attain is actually physical action in this world, because we can grow this relationship while we're embodied souls in this world through the 613 commandments. After 120 years, we could only bask in the glow. We don't have that opportunity. It says that the souls in heaven are very jealous of the people down here who have opportunities to do mitzvahs. Any thoughts before we read this? I want to read this little section inside as a conclusion to chapter 4. Okay, let me share. Let me see if I can share my chapter 4. 1 second. Okay, so so here, the first highlighted section. For this reason, it has been said, 1 hour of repentance and good deeds in this world is better than the whole life of the world to come. Because it's only in this world that a person can engage in active mitzvot. I'm scrolling down to the next section I highlighted. Only when it apprehends and clothes itself in Torah and its mitzvot does it referring to the soul, does it grasp and clothe itself in God himself. For Torah and the Holy One, blessed be he, are one and the same. Meaning God's mitzvahs are directly connected, are directly part of him. When I engage in a mitzvah, I'm grasping God at that time. Although the Torah has been clothed in lowly material things, and the mitzvahs are mostly very action-based, and they don't seem to be very holy and spiritual, it is, by way of illustration, like one who embraces a king. There's no difference in the degree of his closeness and attachment to the king, whether he embraces him when the king is wearing one robe or many robes, since the king's body is in them. And that's really the conclusion of chapter 4. There's a story about, talking about someone who says, I want to express my love for God. It's in my heart. I don't need to do these actions. There's a parable given about a king who asked a guy to bring him a cup of water. And the guy was so overwhelmed with emotion when serving water to the king that he's like, he's so emotional. He's holding that cup of water and he's like shaking and the water's spilling everywhere. And finally he looks at the king's face and he just faints and the water spills everywhere. And the king doesn't get his water. And the king looks at him and says, who gave you permission to faint? I told you what I need. You're supposed to do what I need. I don't care how emotional you're getting. Like, that's not how you're going to express your connection to me. What I need from you now is a cup of water. Not, this. Now, again, the idea is we want to take the emotion that we have and channel it into mitzvahs. So, of course, if I'm able to feel that great emotion, I'm able to do my mitzvah with more emotion. Back to the story of the husband and wife, she'll appreciate it much more if he does the dishes with a big smile and he's really into it and he's feeling all good about it, as opposed to doing it and being annoyed about it. But if there's a choice, either love me a lot but don't do anything, or do it without loving it, the action comes first. Although, of course, I want the action to also be infused with that emotion. So that's not to say that there's no room for emotion in Judaism. There's so much room for our emotion. But we have to remember that the emotion needs to channel into practical action. Okay, chapter 5. I heard a great name for chapter 5. How to feed a starving soul. Everything we discussed in chapter 4 is about connecting, right? Doing. It's all action-based. And then you might say, but my soul just wants to connect deeply. Like, how do I feel that deep connection? I get it. I get that the first thing is I need to do the dishes. Like, I need to do whatever, he wants me to do, because that's how I grasp him. And that's how this relationship works. But how do I create that real deep, intimate connection with God? Because it doesn't seem like I can create that strong intimacy in action. It's like, if we're going to go back to the story of this husband who's doing things for his wife. So he's doing all these things. He gave in. He's going to do everything on her list. And then he stops asking her about what she likes and why she likes it. She's like, don't you want to know why I like the dishes stacked in that particular way? And don't you want to know why, going to see this show with me is like so important to me? Like, I want you to know me. I want you to understand me. And he could say, well, you told me action's the main thing, so I'm just doing everything that you want me to do. She's not too happy about that. She's like, we still need that deep connection. Of course, the basic framework of a relationship is we need to do for each other. But we want more than that in a relationship. We want intimacy. We want real, deep soul connection. How do you create real, deep soul connection with someone? By getting to know them. This is why when we talk to college students today, there's a big disconnect between young men and women who are engaging in physical intimacy, and then they're lacking any real connection. They're like doing a bunch of things together, but they're not really emotionally in it. And they're like, today's generation has a hard time seeing that connection because their relationship begins in such an external way and is so externally focused that at some point it falls apart because they're not really deeply connected to each other. And you have to explain to them that a real relationship, of course you do for each other. That's the basic. In a relationship, we do for each other. But we also work on getting to know each other and making eye contact and talking and connecting. And the more we understand about each other, the more deeply connected we are. So in a human relationship, I want, my person to know me really well. And I want them to sit and listen when I explain what I care about and what fascinates me and what interests me. And I'll do the same for them because that's how we really get to know each other. How do we create that with God? My soul wants to connect. Like it wants to feel like it's deeply, deeply connected in this relationship. So the Tanya calls this food for the soul, meaning my soul wants food. My soul's hungry. How do we feed the soul so that the soul has this deep connection with God? Any thoughts based on the analogy to a human relationship?
Maybe by praying and singing and things like that.
Okay, so praying and singing, they seem to fall more into the action category. They're things that I'm doing.
Yeah.
How do I get to know God? Like connect deeply. So the chapter 5 begins by talking about how do I grasp God? And it's interesting that we use in English as well as in many other languages, we use the term grasp for physical things, like I can grasp an item. That means I really got it. We also use the term grasp for knowledge, like I get it now. I really get it. In those who speak Yiddish, in Yiddish we say, I chap, like I get it. I got it in my mind. When we say that I get something in my mind, what I mean is I've been able to really internalize it, right? Meaning sometimes I can listen to a lecture or read a book or hear something and it kind of goes over my head. And when I'm able to really comprehend something, my mind grasps it and it's inside my mind. And chapter 5 is going to tell us that the way to create real deep connection with God is through getting him, through getting to know him. How do you get to know him? And so the Tanya explains that there's something unique about God. For God, for us, there's who I am, and then there's my knowledge, right? You can study the philosophy that I made up, and you'll get my philosophy. It doesn't mean you're going to get me as a person. You'll get my way of thinking. Part of the uniqueness of God's unity is that God and his knowledge are one. If I can understand God's knowledge, I understand him. If I grasped God's knowledge in my mind, I basically grasped him in my mind. I'm like, I know him. I get him. What's God's knowledge? The Torah. God says, you can study my Torah. My Torah is my intellect. I have given you this Torah. When you study and you comprehend Torah concepts, not just you're getting my knowledge, you're getting me, you're grasping me, which is why, those of you who might be familiar with, let's say, Talmud study. When you study Talmud, some people love it and some people find it frustrating. If you're a very practical person, you might find it very frustrating because a section of Talmud will go something like this. Somebody quotes a concept like, well, if there's a situation where there's two people fighting over one object, what should the law be? And one person says, well, my understanding based on my study of Torah is that the item should belong to this person because of, these particular reasons. And the next person pipes up and says, no, well, actually, the item should belong to the first person because, and like you study it and you're like, okay, well, firstly, this is a whole hypothetical situation. So who even cares? It didn't actually happen. And secondly, like, what's the big deal? You're just fighting over something that's worth a penny. Like, why are we spending so much time studying and trying to comprehend this thing that's like not even relevant? And so what chapter 5 is highlighting and saying that, you know what the biggest value of just studying Torah, even when it's not practical at this time, even when it doesn't feel relevant, because you're filling your mind with godly knowledge. You are comprehending godly knowledge. And in that way alone, you are inserting God into your mind. Now, what's the amazing difference between knowing something and doing something, right? We're going to compare chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 4, we're saying doing things in this relationship is incredible because you're hugging God. You're like grasping him. Think of something that you did this week, an action that you did this week. And are you still feeling the repercussions of that action right now? Is it practically, tangibly affecting you? I cooked dinner a few days ago. Okay, I enjoyed it. It was great. Is it practically, I guess the food is still, to some degree inside me, but I'm not so affected by it now. Contrast that with knowledge. If I read something, I read an interesting fact 3 days ago, and now I know it. It doesn't leave my brain. I can't really unknow something. Yeah, I can forget it over time if it's not important, but there's a unity that I have with my knowledge that I don't have with my actions. Meaning I can do something while I'm doing it, I'm fully in it, and then I go do something else. If I invite you to my house for dinner and I'm about to serve you this really good-looking brisket for Rosh Hashanah, and then I make a comment and I say, by the way, when I was making this brisket, there were like bugs crawling all over it. Don't worry, I washed them off, like it's all good. Enjoy the brisket. You'll be like, oh, really? No, thanks, right? Even though it looks great and you don't see any bugs on it, but you now have a certain knowledge that you cannot unknow. It's a fascinating concept. When we know something intellectually, it becomes part of us in a way that's so much stronger than any action that we do. So what chapter 5 says is that just like food, when I eat food, it becomes part of me. I can't, if I ate 300 donuts this morning or yesterday, I can't deny it. Like, I can't pretend it didn't happen. You'd probably see it on me, right? It becomes part of me. Knowledge to the mind is like food to the body. So just like when I eat food, it becomes part of me. My body breaks it down. It becomes part of my blood and, what everything else is part of me. When I know something, it becomes integrated in my mind. It becomes deeply connected in my mind. And that's why chapter 5 emphasizes that you want to know how to really connect very deeply to God through studying Torah. Study his knowledge. That's like sitting down with your best friend, making eye contact and saying, tell me about yourself. I really want to know you. Thoughts? Harry, it looked like you have something to say.
I'm with you to a point, but getting God sounds arrogant. I mean, yes,
not
I can
it sounds impossible. How do you get an unlimited, infinite thing?
So that's where it's like I can go a certain place with you, and I can think godly thoughts, and I can speak godly things, and I can do godly things, but I will never, no matter how deeply involved in whatever observant, God-centered, get God. I mean,
You're
it's like,
100% right. You're 100% right. And that's why chapter 5 actually begins with a quote from Elijah the prophet. It says, Elijah the prophet says, God, no one can ever fully grasp you. You're infinite. We're finite beings. Except through this gift that you gave us. When we study Torah, we can grasp you. Because your knowledge is part of you. And you've given us the ability to comprehend your knowledge.
so you're saying
do you think it's
that Rebbe, I mean, that they get that they would say that they grasp.
So
I mean, the greatest, where'd you go? Greatest scholars. I mean, I can't even imagine somebody, you know, even the more learned they are, the more humble I would think that they would be, and to say, God, I get you because I've been studying Torah. It just sounds, it doesn't. For me, it does. I mean, I don't know.
Can I throw in a different word? Because I think
Yeah.
I'm getting caught up in it too, and I think it might be semantics. What if instead of grasp, what if the word is glimpse? What if we actually can glimpse what God is all about instead of grasp? Because our little tiny finite pea-sized brains, I have trouble, just like Harriet, with the word grasp. But I feel like I can glimpse the beauty of God. I can glimpse the power of God. So for me, maybe that's my hang up, and I'm hearing it with what Harriet's saying. Anyway, that was just the thought.
So, no, I appreciate you saying that. I think that what this chapter aims to do is actually specifically address that and say, yes, me, a finite, limited human being, can grasp the infinite. It's something incomprehensible. It's not, it wouldn't be possible according to the laws of nature, because my limited mind cannot grasp the unlimited. But God gives us a gift. And he says, study, I'm giving you my knowledge. It's available for you to study. When you are sitting there studying this stuff that I gave you, at that moment, you know what your brain is doing? It is deep diving in godly knowledge. And knowledge is such a close thing to us. It's in many ways a superior unity between me and the knowledge that I grasp than between me and the action that I do. Because while we said a mitzvah allows me to hug God, studying his Torah intellectually and comprehending some of his knowledge intellectually, it means now I have God inside my brain. It's like it became spiritual food to me. So I hear what you're saying. Let's read the first few lines, because I think the first few lines echo exactly what you said. This is the beginning of chapter 5. A further explanation to more fully elucidate the expression tefisa, grasp. In the words of Elijah, Elijah said, no thought can grasp you, which is exactly like Lorraine said. Impossible for a human being to grasp godliness. When any intellect perceives and understands some intellectual subject, the mind grasps that subject and encompasses it. And the subject is grasped and encompassed by and is clothed within the intellect that understood and perceived it. It's an interesting side point, but you know, when you're trying to comprehend something, and you're like, you know, let's say you're studying something, you're studying for an exam, you're reading like a really intellectual book, you're trying to understand a new world view. You're sitting and you're reading it and you're like, You know, you swim in it for a little bit until you say, ah, I got it. So in the beginning, you kind of dive into the knowledge. The knowledge is really grasping you more than you're grasping the knowledge, because you don't fully get it. You're just swimming in it. But slowly, as you begin to understand, you now grasp the knowledge. Now, the Tanya is saying that's imagine what the beautiful unity. This knowledge is grasping you, and you're grasping the knowledge. Now, what if I tell you that this knowledge could be God himself? Because if it's God's knowledge, it's God. God and his knowledge are one. I'm going to scroll down to the next page. Also, the intellect is clothed within the subject at the time of intellectual comprehension and grasping, meaning at first, the concept surrounds my mind, and slowly as I begin to get it, my mind is surrounding the knowledge. So when, for example, one understands and comprehends a particular law in the Mishnah or the Talmud clearly and thoroughly, his intellect is grasping that concept. His intellect is also clothed in it at that time. Now, this knowledge is the wisdom and will of God, because it arose in his will. And this is, when we went back to say a hypothetical situation, right? When I'm trying to understand what would the Jewish law be in a hypothetical situation, and the way that Torah study often goes when I want to give a hypothetical situation, so we use the names of the tribes. So we say, if Reuven would claim so-and-so, and Shimon is claiming so-and-so, what would the verdict be? When I'm trying to grasp that, I'm trying to know, what would the Jewish approach be? Who made the Jewish approach? It's God who made the Jewish approach. So if I can understand the Jewish approach to this, I'm understanding part of God's mind. And if God and his mind are not separate from each other, I am actually internalizing godliness in my own mind at this time. Even if the situation is never going to happen, it's all hypothetical. It's one thing when I'm studying Torah that's very practical. I'm studying, how I should observe Rosh Hashanah. I'm studying, the laws of Shabbat. Here, it's telling us that when I'm just sitting, and by the way, it's something that we're all doing right now because we're studying Tanya, and Tanya is a part of Torah. So just sitting and trying to wrap my mind around these concepts, I'm wrapping my mind around godly concepts. And you know what? When I get them, I have God in my mind. Practically what it means is, when somebody really, how does a worldview change? When I know things, think of someone who studied medicine their whole life. They see life through that lens of medicine. Everything they see, it's healthy, it's unhealthy, it's safe, it's not safe, this might happen, that might happen. Somebody who's an engineer views life through like an engineering lens. When I fill my mind with Torah study, I start seeing the world from a godly view. And it should affect me. The more, and when you were saying, a rabbi who studies so much Torah, like, does he get God? Of course, there's a part he can't sit and say, I fully understand God. I don't think anyone can say that. But this person definitely has a godly view of seeing the world, which is why when I'm struggling to understand something in Judaism, I like to talk to someone who has studied a lot of Torah, because I trust that their perspective is much more in line with God's view than my perspective is. Just like if I'm trying to understand a medical concept, I'm going to talk to my doctor friend, because I know that they have so much knowledge of medicine that their worldview is much more aligned with, the medical way of looking at things. We're still in the middle of chapter 5. We will continue it next week, God willing. But this was the beginning of it, of feeding my soul. And that's really the theme. Like, we already established that I hug God through doing his actions. But now we're trying to say, how do I create that like deep, intimate connection? And chapter 5 is bringing out that through study alone, even study that doesn't lead to action, study alone is valuable because it puts God into my brain. Arlene, I know you had your hand up for a really long time, and Raina.
I just was thinking what Lorraine and Harriet were saying about how could we ever think to grasp the infinite? And I'm thinking perhaps we never will. Perhaps what God is offering us in the Torah is the portion of Him that we can grasp, but certainly not the totality of Him.
100%. I agree. I thank you for clarifying that. You're right. We're never going to grasp the totality of him, but even the ability to grasp any of him. I'm a human being. How can I put godliness in my brain? It's infinite. It doesn't make sense that a finite brain could grasp something infinite.
Yeah.
And that's a gift. He says, I'm giving you a gift. I'm giving you my knowledge in a way that a human brain can comprehend. Go study. The more you study, the more you'll know me.
But if you study Torah or Talmud and you have a situation and then you argue the different sides of the situation, we don't know what God's resolution is. We only hear the arguments of those who are studying it. So then how do we know what God thinks about that?
That's such a good question. It lines up with what you mentioned last time, which I know we still need to like set a time to just talk about it, which is how does any Torah that we call Torah that comes from the oral tradition, how has that become part of Torah? If I read something in the Talmud that was said by a certain rabbi, what makes it Torah? Right?
Yeah.
So I think we touched upon it last time, but in short, if we think of the two parts of Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah, when Moses taught Torah to the Jewish people, he came down from Mount Sinai and he spent 40 years in the desert teaching Torah to the Jews. What did he teach them? He taught them orally. Everything he taught them the details of the mitzvahs and how they're done and how they're not done, how to pray, and, and then he gave them the text of the 5 books of Moses. The text doesn't have nearly as much detail as what Moses taught them orally. It can probably be compared to sitting in a university classroom and having the professor lecture and then give you the textbook. If you just read the textbook, you probably wouldn't pass the exam because there's so much more that's discussed and explained in the lecture. The textbook is just like the Cliff Notes version of what this class is about. Now, how do we know this? If you open up the Torah, we all familiar with the paragraph of the Shema. The paragraph of Shema tells us you should write it on your doorposts. What am I supposed to write on my doorposts? Doesn't tell me. How am I supposed to write it on my doorpost? Doesn't tell me. Do I take a Sharpie and I just start writing things on my doorpost? Like, how do I fulfill this commandment? It doesn't make sense. It says you should bind it between your eyes and next to your heart. All right, bind what? Like a Torah scroll? Should I wrap a Torah scroll around my eyes? Like, it doesn't make sense. And so much of Torah is like that. If you try to comprehend the Torah from the actual text, it's impossible to fully understand. But what happened? There was a tradition. Moses set up a way of studying. He said, I'm teaching this to you, and now you need to sit and review this with your students. And then the students review it with their students. And there was a very specific method of teaching and review so that the Torah is transmitted from generation to generation. So for many, many generations, the Jews studied an insane amount of Torah all orally, meaning they had the text, the basic text. Most of what they were studying and doing was orally. The laws of kosher. The 5 books of Moses don't outline exactly how kosher is done. It says you should not, cook a kid goat in its mother's milk. What does that tell me? How do I understand the details of how to do this? But it was transmitted in a very specific way. Now, what happened was about 2,000 years ago, at the time, until 2,000 years ago, Jews were all living in Israel with a holy temple. We had a very structured way for Jewish life. At the time of the destruction of the temple, the rabbis at the time realized that things are about to change drastically for our people. the temple's going to be destroyed. It was imminent. It was clear that that's what was going to happen. Jews are going to be scattered all over the world. How in the world are we going to maintain our traditions and our way of life? It's all going to get lost. This whole method that we have of oral transmission is going to get lost. And so there was a declaration of the rabbis at the time, we have to start writing down all of these oral traditions. And so that's when the Mishnah was written, followed by the Talmud, followed by many other books. All of those things that were documented, if you study it, you see it's like Rabbi Meir said, my teacher taught me that this is how we fulfill this particular mitzvah. And then someone else comes in and says, well, my teacher told it to me slightly differently. And then they'll sit and argue it out, and they'll each bring their proof until there's a conclusion of what is the proper way to do this mitzvah. But ultimately, what they were documenting is not things that they thought up one day. Everything that was documented in what we call the oral tradition or the oral Torah were all things that had been studied for 1,000 years by Jewish people. They just had never been written down. That's what we call today the oral Torah. So when we study Talmud, when we study Mishnah, I mean, all of our laws, most of Judaism today that we keep, we only know how to keep it because of the oral tradition that was thankfully documented, because if it wasn't documented 2,000 years ago, it would have been lost today. So back to your question, when the rabbis in the Talmud are arguing over, what is the exact correct way to say Shema? Are you supposed to be standing up or lying down when you say the evening Shema? And they're bringing their proofs. It's not their own ideas. They're transmitting Torah knowledge that has been passed down since the days of Moses. So it is very much part of Torah. It's the oral part of Torah. And that's why when it comes to oral Torah, sources are so important, because, anyone could come today and write a book and say, well, here are my thoughts about how to pray. But it could only be considered part of Torah if they're clearly sourced in something that could date back all the way to what was written down back then, when we know that the traditions were being held very strongly. So there are very clear rules about what could be included in oral Torah, what can't be included in oral Torah. But in the big picture, studying Tanya is still studying Torah. It's just parts of the Torah that hadn't been documented until a certain period in history. That make sense? Lorraine, what are you thinking? Oh, wait, sorry, Raina, I know you've been raising your hand for a while. You want to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking that with the Torah, what I see is God's will for mankind and God's desire for mankind. It becomes really complicated, I think, for me as well, when I think of God's knowledge and all of the natural laws out there. We're not Einsteins. We are not going to be able to decode the natural laws. And that is also the mind of God. Definitely. This is how I see it, because nothing is outside of the mind of God. But in the Torah, what I see is the will of God. This is God's desire for mankind to behave a certain way with each other, but also how to connect with Him, so that we can have how to have a relationship. So that's how I've always separated those two, because, God's mind, I can't even understand mine. So
thank you. Thank you for explaining that. So what you're saying is that you see the practical element of Torah, meaning where the Torah tells us this is how you should live, that's God's will. If there's a part of Torah there are whole sections of Torah that talk about laws that were kept in the temple. They're not practical today. Is there a point of studying those laws? is there a point of trying to understand how God wanted the temple to operate? If my perspective is only practical, then I would say there's no point. Because if I can't carry these out, they obviously don't apply to me. They only apply in temple times. Then there are whole parts of Torah that perhaps should be, pushed to the side for now.
Wait, but Deanie, can you do the practical? Because Arlene last time, and this has stayed with me all week, Arlene, I've been trying to figure this out. Last time she asked the thing, and I'm just going to use your same example, but I have a million other ones. But the whole thing about linen and wool, so if it doesn't make sense, forget that we can't do it. Forget the 200 or the 300 that we can't do. But one that just doesn't, why would an all-powerful, all-knowing, infinity entity care what my skirt is made of? Why would that? So, even something that you could grasp, what happens when you can't grasp it? That's what, I mean, I think that's where I'm getting stuck with the whole grasp thing, and where sometimes it's just easier to do than to try to grasp. I can't even grasp something that easy and technically we could all do that, but I can't grasp it. It doesn't make any sense to me.
So you're touching upon a few important things. Firstly, in terms of what Raina was saying, the practical versus the knowledge. So there's the practical of, am I going to learn how to do these laws? Am I going to try to do these laws? That's one piece. Is there value in studying the laws? There's a lot of laws. How much wool? How much linen? What does it mean when they're in the same garment? What does it mean when they're not in the same garment? Just sitting and studying these laws, if we're going to change the word grasp with maybe fill my mind. When I am engaged in trying to understand these laws, not the reason for the laws, but trying to understand how these laws work, what the Tanya is telling us now, that at that moment, I am filling my mind with these laws, whether they're relevant or irrelevant or practical or impractical. At that moment, I'm filling my mind with godliness and God's knowledge. And there's value to that as well. Even if I'm not actively doing the mitzvah, studying the details of the mitzvah, there's a great value in that, because I'm now grasping God. I'm now filling my mind with godliness. So there's God in my mind. God is filling my mind. What a great thing to have in my mind. So that's the idea of, what Raina was saying, God's will, and then God himself. God's will, yes, I need to know what to do. That's the practical, but there's tremendous value. And, they don't call us the people of the book for nothing. The people of the book, we're the only religion that places so much emphasis on study, not just study to know how to do, but just study for the sake of studying, for the sake of filling our minds and our brains and our world perspective with godliness, so that we look out at the world through a godly perspective, because that's what's reverberating in our mind. So that's the idea of, godly knowledge versus practically engaging in the actions that God wants us to do. What you're touching upon also, which is similar to what Arlene said last time, is why would God want us to do things that make no sense? So to that question, we can say a few different things. Firstly, so if I'm in love with someone and they like ridiculous things that make no sense, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to say, well, I don't know, you're just insane. You like ridiculous things, and those things I refuse to do. I'll do everything you like that makes sense to me. The things that you care about, like you really care about having that type of soap and not the other type of soap. You care about having Sunday mornings off, and you'll refuse to take any other morning off instead. You insist on, taking these types of trips and not those type of trips. Some of your idiosyncrasies make no sense to me. I'm not dealing with those. They don't make sense. We don't do that in human relationships. If we really care about someone, You say, I'm going to try to understand you, but there's some parts of you I'm never understanding. But guess what? I love you, and I'm doing it for you anyway. But I think there's another piece that you touched upon is, why would God want things that make no sense, right? Like if he's so infinite, he shouldn't care about some details. There's a fascinating concept that Tanya brings up quite a few times, is that we sometimes, by trying to make God so infinite, we actually limit him. If I say, God is so infinite, he doesn't care about whether I'm using a blue pen or a black pen, I'm actually limiting him, because I'm saying that he's too infinite to care about a small detail. True infinity is going to be everywhere, in the biggest places and in the most minute places. If I'm saying that God is too infinite to care about the color of my pen, I'm actually creating a limitation on him. That's not real infinity. Real infinity has no limitations. So, that's to answer that piece. But on a very simple level, it's like in a relationship. I will never understand why he chose those things. I can try. There are many, we're talking about benefits of mitzvahs. So there's a whole element to mitzvahs. There's a whole school of thought that explains, actually Maimonides talks about this a lot, that mitzvahs are actually really good for you. And Maimonides and other commentaries will go into different mitzvahs that don't seem to make sense, and will give us a lot of reasons why actually these, even though the Torah doesn't give us reason for it, these mitzvahs actually are really good for you. For example, I think we mentioned this last time, keeping kosher. And it's not just Maimonides. There are books and books and books written by different scholars who are trying to explain why really the mitzvah of kosher is good for you. Because, they'll go into health benefits, which are disputed by others. But, we're talking about this perspective. They'll talk about health benefits. They'll talk about personality benefits. When I have to think about everything that I eat, imagine everyone in this world thought 5 times before they ate something. I sometimes think of, my little kid, if you came and offered them a candy, they say, well, firstly, is this kosher? Am I allowed to have it? And the next question would be, is it dairy? Because I'm having chicken for dinner. So if it's dairy, I can't eat this now, and there's a whole back and forth until, oh, it's okay, I can eat the candy, right? So there's a whole school of thought that argues why it's so good for people to keep kosher, because it makes you very conscious and very mindful, and you build a lot of boundaries into your life, on and on and on. Of course, we can study those. But at the end of the day, God doesn't give us a reason why we should keep kosher. He just says, this is my idiosyncrasy. This is what I want. So, one's not a contradiction to the next. On one hand, I'm going to do what my lover wants me to do, whether I get it or not. On the other hand, I'm also going to spend time trying to understand them, because I feel like it'll be easier for me to do what they want me to do when I could at least appreciate some details of it. But that's not ultimately the reason that I do it. I do it because that's what they want. And I'm in this relationship, and I want them to do things that I want, whether they understand it or not. Yes, Raina.
Let me see. Yeah, there is a very interesting bit at the on the very first chapter.
Okay.
That I thought was so interesting because I had not seen it anywhere else. And this is my interpretation, okay?
Okay.
Where it said, be righteous and be not wicked. And even if the whole world tells you that you are righteous, regard yourself as wicked. Well, but be righteous. And then, and I didn't write it down, so I don't know how I put 2 and 2 together, where it said that God also has given us the ability to do that. So we were not just born with that commandment to be righteous, but also with the full power and capacity to do so. And which of course made me think about the 613 mitzvot. For some of us modern people, we think, oh my God, that's too much. But then we know that we were born with that ability to do it. It's not beyond me as a human being. I wouldn't give that to a dog, right? I wouldn't even give him one mitzvah to do. He can't do, he wasn't born with that ability. But God has made me able to do that. So God is not asking of me more than I can do.
100%. And that's actually the premise of the whole Tanya in the
And
introduction to the Tanya.
it was right there at the beginning.
Yeah.
It was right there. If you go back, and I know I just wrote down what I thought, what I got out of it without, and I was looking to see, is there just one or two words or one or two sentences that would show how that was the premise of the very first few paragraphs of the Tanya.
100%. In the introduction to the Tanya, the author of the Tanya says, my goal in writing this book is to show you that actually it's attainable. To live the way God wants you to live is attainable. And I'm going to show you how. And so part of this whole buildup that we have in the first few chapters in understanding my soul and the difference between who I am and who I think I am and what I actually do, and that seeming, incompatibility sometimes is okay, because God's not expecting me to be a perfect person on the inside. He's expecting me to be in control so that I can do perfect, even without being perfect. And what you mentioned of the first line of Tanya, I believe we mentioned it here, is that the word that's used is mashbi'in oto. A soul is made to swear, to take an oath, I will be righteous.
Right.
And the word mashbi'in, the same root of the word oath, is also the word sova, satisfied, satiated. So yes, the soul is taking an oath, but at the same time, the soul is satiated and filled up with all the power that it needs to get through this journey of life and do what it needs to do. So when our life is mapped out for us, which we don't know, but like our soul comes into this world, there's a specific roadmap that every soul is going to live through. We know that we were given that power from the get-go to get through whatever challenges we are specifically going to face. So yeah, that's a very comforting thought. I think that seems so hard, but like, I know I got it. I have it in me to do it. Now I just need to figure out how, but it's within me to really live up to these expectations. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it gave me, and just this last thing just the last thing that you said, it gave me that comfort as well. Oh, so if I'm given everything to be able to do as many mitzvot as God gives me, of course, I don't do many of them, but he has also given me that ability and power, as you said, to withstand whatever is going on the day-to-day life.
We only have to work on one mitzvah at a time. And then we have to look at them as opportunities, not obligations. And I think that perspective also makes it easier. It's not like, oh gosh, I have to. It's like this big burden we're carrying, but oh my, I get to. Like, hey, I get to connect again. I'm going to dip apples in honey. Great. I'm going to connect Rosh Hashanah. What other connection points am I able to tap into? I'll go for as many as I can. I'm never going to be perfect, but let me keep trying and growing. And as long as I realize that it's not all or nothing, And it's not hypocritical to do what I can and not to do what I can't. And as long as I have this growth mindset, I'm right on the right path of where I'm supposed to be. Good night, everybody. This was great post Tanya conversation.
Great class, thank you.
See you all next Monday.
Interesting. Thought-provoking.
Yes. Thank you all.
Have a good week.
Bye-bye.